I'm going to talk about, well, you can't talk about the whole subject of consciousness, too much, but I'm going to talk about certain aspects of it. And I guess the question I'm going to ask is, why is so much sheer nonsense talked about consciousness? We're all conscious. It's a biological product of processes in the brain. And yet, as we're going to see in what follows, there are a great many mistakes made about the subject of consciousness and its relation to a whole lot of other subjects, such as information, reason, rationality, decision-making, and all of the other psychological phenomena. And my own view is that our discussion of consciousness has been bedeviled by two traditions that pretend to be opposed to each other, but in fact they both make the same mistake. The first tradition is the tradition of God, the soul, and immortality that says that consciousness is not an ordinary part of the physical, biological world. On the contrary, it's a part of a special spiritual world. Consciousness is not created by brain processes. It's a property of the soul, and it has to be created by God. And consequently, there can't be a science of consciousness because it's not part of the reality that science can talk about. Now, there's another tradition that thinks it's opposed to the tradition of God, the soul, and immortality, but it makes the same mistake. This is the tradition of scientific materialism. What the tradition of God, the soul, and immortality says is consciousness is not an ordinary part of the physical world. And that's what the tradition of scientific materialism says. It's not an ordinary part of the physical world. Either it doesn't exist at all, or if it does exist, it's outside the bounds of a serious science. And when I first got interested in this, I thought, well, you know, consciousness, it's a biological problem. So I went over to the University of California, San Francisco, where they have a big neurobiology gang. And I said, you know, why don't you guys get busy and solve the problem of consciousness? How does the brain do it? What am I paying you to do? And the answer was very revealing. The answer was, look, it's not science. Maybe it's okay for philosophers and theologians to talk about consciousness, but serious scientists do not talk about consciousness. And one guy, quite a famous brain stabber, said to me, look, in my discipline, it's okay to talk about consciousness, but get tenure first. Get tenure first. Now, I've been militating against that attitude for 30 years, and I think now there is a change. Now you can actually get tenure by writing about consciousness. So that is a step forward. It isn't that the writing is so terrific, but anyway, at least it's a step forward. Okay, now there is so much nonsense talked about the relation of consciousness, information, rationality, intelligence, and all those things that I want to begin by citing a couple of contemporary mistakes. If you read the newspapers, you will typically read something like the following. There's a wonderful computer that can beat the world's best chess player. And now I never watched, there's a program called Jeopardy. I don't even know how to spell it. Apparently it's not a sentence, but it's got an exclamation point at the end. And there's a computer that can beat players at Jeopardy. Now this ought to make us nervous, you see, because when Garry Kasparov beat Karpov, he had to be conscious that he was playing chess, right? But when Deep Blue beat Kasparov, it wasn't conscious of playing chess because it wasn't conscious of anything. So what's going on? How can you play chess if you're totally unconscious? And I'm going to argue that the sense in which an unconscious system plays chess is totally different from the sense that matters to us, and it's a serious confusion in intellectual life. So let me start by making a couple of rather boring distinctions. It's going to turn out they're crucially important for this whole discussion. The first is the distinction between two different senses of the objective-subjective distinction. Objectivity and subjectivity loom large in our intellectual culture, so it's important to get clear about them. But they have two completely different senses. In the first sense, the distinction is a distinction between types of claims. Some claims you can say, as they say, as a matter of objective fact. Those are, I will say, epistemically objective. I'm sorry to use these polysyllabic words. Epistemic just means having to do with knowledge. And in the epistemic sense, objectivity is contrasted with subjectivity, and those are two different kinds of claims. So if I say Rembrandt lived his life, most of his life in Amsterdam, that is epistemically objective. You can settle that, as a matter of fact. If I say Rembrandt was the greatest Dutch painter that ever lived, well, I think it's probably right, but it's a matter of, as they say, subjective opinion. That's the distinction between epistemic objectivity and subjectivity. Now, related, underlying that is a distinction in modes of existence. And this is the ontological. Ontological just means having to do with existence. In the ontological sense, the distinction is between those features of reality that exist independently of anybody's experience. Those are ontologically objective, and those that exist only insofar as they are experienced, and they are ontologically subjective. So ontologically objective entities would include mountains and molecules and tectonic plates, and ontological subjective entities would include pains and tickles and itches and headaches and feeling anxiety and all the rest of it. Ontologically subjective entities only exist insofar as they are experienced by a human or animal subject. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, it's going to turn out it's important for a whole lot of reasons. But one reason it's important is that the ontological subjectivity of a domain does not prevent us from having an epistemically objective science of that domain. And the problem I had with those guys in San Francisco, they thought that because consciousness is ontologically subjective, we can't have a science of consciousness because science is objective. But of course, science is epistemically objective in the sense that scientists try to get truths that are independent of anybody's feelings and attitudes. But the ontological subjectivity of the domain of consciousness does not prevent us from making epistemically objective claims about the causes and nature of consciousness. I hope that's clear, because an awful lot of mistakes are based on supposing that because consciousness has a subjective mode of existence, it can't be studied by an objective science. And the answer is it can. It's a different sense of the objective-subjective distinction. In one sentence, the ontological subjectivity of a domain does not prevent us from having an epistemically objective science of that domain. Okay, you got that under your belt. Now here comes another boring distinction. You need another distinction, which is crucial, is a distinction between those features of the world that exist regardless of what anybody thinks. They are, as I will say, observer independent, or sometimes, just to be offensive, I say they're intrinsic or absolute. And again, mountains, molecules, and tectonic plates have this observer independent existence. But there are an awful lot of things that are important to us that only exist as what they are because people have certain attitudes about them. And they are, as I will say, observer relative or observer dependent. And that would include a lot of things that matter to us, like money and private property and government and the University of Indiana. All of those are created by human consciousness, but the existence that they have is observer relative. It's not a fact of physics, but rather it's an attitude, a matter of attitudes that people take toward physical and other sorts of phenomena that constitute the ontology of money, private property, marriage, governments, universities, cocktail parties, and summer vacations, and a whole lot of others. I'm going to talk more about all of that civilization stuff on Thursday, but I want you to see now that there is a domain of reality about which we can make epistemically objective claims, which is observer dependent. That is to say, it's created by consciousness. Now, here's an interesting fact that's going to emerge as of some importance later. The consciousness that creates civilization creates an observer relative ontology. It creates an observer relative ontology, but the consciousness that creates it, though ontologically subjective, is not observer relative. On the contrary, it's intrinsic. So this stuff I carry around in my wallet, I'll show off how rich I am here. Here's a dollar bill. This is money only because we think it's money, okay? So its being money is not intrinsic or observer independent, it's observer relative. But the fact that I think it's money, that's absolute. That's observer independent. The consciousness that creates civilization, though it creates an observer relative set of entities, is not itself observer relative. Okay, now then, we got some basic distinctions under our belt. Now I want to tell you about some mistakes that are being made as we sit here. And it takes my breath away when I read these. There's a book that's just coming out by a guy who argues as follows. We now are getting close to having intelligent computers. And very soon we're going to have super intelligent computers. The guy's name is Bostrom. He teaches in Oxford. And here's what Bostrom says. When we get super intelligent computers, they're going to be so much more intelligent than we are that they're likely to rise up and kill us all. They're likely to just overthrow all of us. Now, I want to ask this guy, why don't you just pull the plug? But, you know, that seems like... that seems a bit Philistine. I want to say there's got to be some more deep phenomenon going on here. And there's another guy, I have to review these books, so I had to read them more carefully than I otherwise would. There's another guy named Floridi, also teaches in Oxford, and Floridi says, we've entered a new era. There's a new revolution. Copernicus announced the Copernican revolution, that we were no longer the center of the universe. Darwin announced the Darwinian revolution, that we were not God's special creation. Freud announced the Freudian revolution, that we weren't in control of our own minds. And somebody, presumably the author, is now announcing the fourth revolution, the information revolution. Not only do we know a hell of a lot, that's information, but in fact, everything is information. We live in a universe of information, and he says in a wonderful parody of Hegel, what is real is information, and what is information is what is real. It's a parody of Hegel's what's rational is real and what's real is rational. But in any case, I have deep suspicions about both of these claims, and I now want to articulate my suspicions. First, I'll get a drink of water. Now, I have to cover a lot of ground. I hope I'm not talking too fast. Everybody looks like they understand everything so far. This is the illusion that professors get. And then you read the blue books. But anyway, okay, here goes. Let us consider these notions that we've been talking about, information and computation. And let's start with computation. Now, as you all know, the original meaning of computer was it was a person who computes. A computer was a guy who computes. The same way a runner is a guy who runs, or a singer is somebody who sings. So a computer was a person who computes. This is why Turing's famous article is called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. Not called Computers and Intelligence, because computers named a profession, a class of people whose job was to compute. And nowadays, with the invention of a device called a digital computer, the word has changed its meaning. Computer now is used to mean a piece of machinery and not a type of person. By the way, the guy who's responsible for that is Turing. Turing invented a wonderful device called the Turing machine. And the Turing machine is unique in that it does what any computer can do, what any real live human computer can do, using only two kinds of symbols. These are usually thought of as zeros and ones, but anything will do. And indeed, in a wonderful argument presented independently by both Turing and Alonzo Church, they show that any algorithm at all can be implemented on a Turing machine, on a device that uses only two kinds of symbols. It's a wonderful original idea, and it has transformed all of our lives because, though strictly speaking, the notion of a Turing machine is the notion of something formal and abstract. I mean, you can't go into a shop and say, I want to buy a Turing machine, because it's not something you can weighs anything. You can't pour beer on a Turing machine. I did once on a real computer. And you can't drop it on the floor. But for practical purposes, the machine that you buy in the store is a Turing machine because it operates with two types of symbols. They're not, I'm very literal. My instinct is to open up the damn thing and find the zeros and ones. But there aren't any zeros and ones in there. There are such things as variable rates of electrical voltage levels, and they do this at such stunning speed that we can now do all kinds of marvelous things with computers. But what Turing didn't notice is that in changing the meaning of the word computer, he also changed the meaning of the word computation. Let's ask ourselves, is computation as defined by Turing, is that observer independent, or is it observer relative? Well, contrast me adding 2 plus 2 to get 4. Now that's a computation. I am a computer carrying out a computation. But that is observer independent. That's intrinsic. It doesn't matter what other people say. They say, well, you're not really doing addition. Oh, yes, I am. I am doing addition. That's observer independent. But when I take my pocket calculator and do 2 plus 2 equals 4, the result is not something that is observer independent. The processes are computation only relative to a computational interpretation. Computation, as defined by Alan Turing and is now common in the literature on the subject, is an observer-relative notion. It's not a fact of physics that the machine is computing. Rather, the fact of physics enables us to attach a computational interpretation to the operations of the machine. But that's the first important result I want to state tonight, and that is that computation is observer relative. Computations are either performed by conscious agents, those are observer independent, and those are intrinsic, but the computation that's performed by the piece of machinery you own, that is all observer relative. Nothing wrong with that, because we know that though all observer relative phenomena contain an element of ontological subjectivity, it's only relative to conscious agents that they have the observer relative features, that does not prevent us from making epistemically objective claims about that domain. We can make epistemically objective claims, such as I wrote a book using the Word program of Microsoft, and that's epistemically objective, even though Word program does not name a feature of physics. It names an observer relative phenomena that we have found ways to attach to physical phenomena, to electrical state transitions. Okay, now let's slow down and think about computation, because it's going to be important for the rest of the discussion. In the standard accounts, the early claims were that they had invented computers that could actually have thought processes. And my favorite here was John McCarthy of Stanford, who said, even a machine as simple as a thermostat can have beliefs. And I said to him, oh, John, what beliefs does your thermostat have? And he said, my thermostat has 3 beliefs. It's too cold in here, it's too hot in here, or it's just right in here. Now, the pedant in me wanted to say, that's bad thermostat science. The thermostat's a bimetallic strip. It's only got maximum 2 beliefs, but it doesn't have any beliefs at all. Why? The attribution of beliefs to the thermostat is an attribution of observer relative intentionality. There's no literally any beliefs in the thermostat. We can treat the thermostat as if it had beliefs, as we can treat the computer as if it had memory, as if it was annoyed with me when it complains about my ineptitude at operating the keyboard. But none of that is intrinsic or observer independent. All of that is observer relative. Now that led me to advance an argument which went as follows. The standard definition of computation that we have from Alan Turing is that computation is a matter of manipulating syntax, manipulating symbols, as I said, usually thought of as zeros and ones, but any symbols will do. But of course, the syntax of the computational operation is not sufficient for the semantics of actual human cognition. So if you have a computer that can answer questions in Chinese, it doesn't follow that the computer understands Chinese. On the contrary, it couldn't understand Chinese, because to understand Chinese, you have to have something more than syntax. You've got to have semantics. You have to know what the words mean. And I illustrated that treating myself as the computer. Imagine I'm locked in a room, and I'm given a bunch of questions in Chinese, and then I look up what I'm supposed to do in the computer program, and I give back answers in Chinese. Now, unknown to me, the input consists of questions, and the rules that I follow to give back Chinese symbols as answers, those are answers to the questions, and we'll suppose that the guys get so good at writing the program, and I get so good at shuffling the symbols, that my answers are indistinguishable from a native Chinese speaker. I passed the famous Turing test for understanding Chinese. But all the same, I don't understand a word of Chinese, and there's no way I could, because I'm just a computer. I have what the computer has. I simply have rules for manipulating symbols. I have a syntax, but no semantics. And the human cognition requires more than a syntax. It requires a semantics. Now, I thought that was kind of an obvious argument, and I felt vaguely embarrassed that we get paid money to present such simple arguments. You'd be surprised at the amount of crap that was thrown at me. In the introductory speech, it was kindly mentioned how many times my article is referred to, but he forgot to mention how many attacks there are on it. At last count, I counted 200 published attacks in English alone. I'm leaving out Turkish and Swahili and lots of other languages. Anyway, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but some of the attacks were sort of fun in that they revealed the fundamental behaviorism underlying the computational picture. And the idea was, well, look, the machine behaves as if it understood Chinese, so it must understand Chinese. And one guy, this was in a public debate, said, suppose we ask you the question, do you understand Chinese? Ha! And you give back the answer, yes. Well, doesn't that show? Well, let's try that out. I think let's take it seriously. I get a symbol that looks like this. This will be in a dialect of Chinese that some of you won't recognize. And that question means, do you understand Chinese? I don't know what it means. I got this symbol. So I look up in the book what I'm supposed to do, and it says when you get that symbol, give them back a symbol that looks like this. It's in that same dialect of Chinese. And this symbol means, why do you ask me so many dumb questions? Can't you see that I understand Chinese? Okay, it's kind of an obvious point, but in one sentence, the problem with the computational theory of the mind and the computational theory of consciousness is that the computer only has a syntax. It has no semantics. And the actual human cognition requires more than a syntax. It requires a semantics. But now I want to make what I think is a much deeper and more important point, and that's this. Syntax is observer relative. The syntax is indeed what the computer operates with, because it's a syntactical machine. But the fact that something is a computer program, that the fact that the system is implementing a computer program, that is observer relative. It's our interpretation that makes it a computational process, and the interpretation is not intrinsic to the physics. Now, if you look closely at this, you will find that most of the stuff that's talked about computation and information ends up as a kind of nonsense, because it neglects these 2 points, that the syntax is not sufficient for the computation. The syntax is not sufficient for the semantics, but the more deep point is that the syntax is observer relative. Something is syntactical only relative to a syntactical interpretation. And if you look at the literature on this, and as I mentioned these 2 books by Bostrom and Floridi, if you look at the literature, the crucial notions, the notion of computation, of information, of reasoning, of deciding, of rationality, all of those have 2 different senses. they have an observer-independent sense where they describe actual psychological phenomena, and they have an observer-relative sense where they describe something going on in the machinery that we are able to interpret using the psychological vocabulary. There's nothing wrong with that. That seems to me perfectly legitimate to say, my computer today has a better memory than the computer I had 20 years ago. And I use the word memory there, but it doesn't mean anything Proustian. It doesn't mean the computer is reflecting on its happy life when it was just a child in China. No, it does not have any literal memory in any observer-independent sense. It has this observer-relative phenomenon. So the problem with the literature on all of these guys that I've been talking about is that the crucial psychological notions, information, rationality, decision, believing, remembering, and indeed computing and information, all of those have two different senses. They have an observer-independent sense, which is dependent on consciousness. It's only a conscious agent that can have all of those phenomena in the observer-independent sense, that can literally remember or compute or calculate or make decisions or create information. But they also have a perfectly legitimate but observer-dependent, observer-relative sense in which they only are what they are relative to conscious agents who attach a certain type of interpretation. Okay, now with that in mind, let's go to Bostrom's argument. He says we ought to be really scared. And he says this may be the greatest, I love authors because they always invent this kind of sentence. This may be the greatest challenge that humans have ever faced. And the challenge is super intelligent computers will rise up and overthrow us all. I want to say that's not a serious worry. Why? Well, he says, we don't know what's going to motivate these computers. They're going to be so smart that they may have types of motivations we can't even understand. They may be motivated by kind of malice that's really beyond our ken altogether. And if they're really malicious computers and super intelligent, we haven't got a chance. Now, he does say we have one great advantage. We got here first. And he is going to tell us how to plan to fight these guys. And I want to tell you, this is all a fantasy. You see, the computers could be maliciously motivated only if they could have actual observer-independent motivations. But they don't. It's just a hunk of junk. It's just a bunch of electrical state transitions. And we can interpret any way we like. In order to have the basic human cognitive faculties for believing and desiring and deciding and making decisions and being malicious or being beneficent, you have to be conscious. You have to either be actually conscious or, if you're sound asleep, at least capable of becoming conscious. And that's what gets neglected in this literature, is the crucial role of consciousness. Now, that's a big claim on my part. Let me substantiate it. Okay, I'll take a drink of water and catch my breath. He thinks, just as we engage in decision-making and carry out actions, so computers will engage in decision-making and carry out actions. I want to say it's totally different in the two cases. Let me give you some real-life examples. It frequently happens to me, more nowadays than it used to, that I get puzzled, have I misspelled a word? Now, I have a desire, watch this vocabulary, a desire to spell correctly, and a belief that I can discover the correct spelling by looking it up in a dictionary. I realize an old-fashioned procedure, but anyway, I'm an old guy. Looking it up in the dictionary, so I perform an action, I look it up in the dictionary. Practical reason, belief and desire produce action. Okay, everybody's got that? All of that is real. All of that is observer independent. Now, what happens in my computer? If I misspell a word, it comes up in red. Is that because the computer thinks this idiot has misspelled another word and we're going to tell him? No, it has a list of words, and if a word comes up that's not on the list, it comes up in red. And it will even cleverly suggest them alternative spellings. Often they're idiotic, but totally unrelated words, but it'll suggest them alternative words. Now, I had, and this is practical reason, I had a belief and a desire, and on the basis of my belief and a desire, I performed a course of action. This has a name in the history of philosophy. It's called practical reason. Now, what has the computer got? It's got no belief, no desire, except in an observer relative sense, except in the sense that we can describe it that way metaphorically, and it's quite useful often to do that, but it doesn't literally have beliefs and desires. Of course, we can imagine as a science fiction fantasy that a whole lot of computers suddenly rise up and attack us. But if we're supposed to imagine that that comes out of some malicious motivation that the computers have, it's only malicious motivation if there's some real psychology there, if there's some actual observer-independent reality to the motivation, and there isn't. To put this succinctly, in the observer-independent sense, the intelligence that the super-intelligent computer has is zero. Zero. It isn't that it's got a little bit of intelligence, maybe more. It's zero. All of the intelligence is relative to our interpretation. Watch. You think that's too far-fetched? I'll show you a computer that just performed a computational operation. It computed the function S equals 1/2 GT squared. I'll spare you writing that on the blackboard. And of course, with accurate timing measurement, we could actually use it to compute the value of S. But if this is a computer, then anything is a computer, because computation only exists relative to an interpretation. In the old Chinese room days, in these debates, I used to take an object like that, slam it on the table, and say, that is a digital computer. It just has a boring program. The program says, stay there. Well, it did mostly stay there. Okay, and of course, that's absolutely right. It satisfies the definition. A computer is anything to which you can attach a computational interpretation, and I attached the interpretation of this, 0 or 1. This one was an analog computer because it computed a continuous function, but an analog computer, digital computer, doesn't make any difference. You can simulate one on the other. Okay, the deep point in all of this is do not confuse in the intrinsic or observer-independent psychological phenomena with the observer-relative or derivative psychological phenomena, which is all in us. The observer-independent facts, the actual physical facts, are facts about electrical state transitions. Well, couldn't the computers, in virtue of their electrical state transitions, rise up against us? Well, as a science fiction fantasy, you can imagine that. You can imagine maybe the cars will all rise up against us. They'll come tearing out of the garages and run over us. Okay. Or shoes will at last get tired of being stepped on, and they'll get out of the closet and start walking all over us. I got no objection to science fiction. But this guy clearly thinks that he's identified a real problem. Malicious computers will come at us. And I want to say there is no real malice in the electronic computer because it's not that kind of machine. It's not built to have anything like that. It's built to perform electrical state transitions at a very rapid rate, at a stunningly rapid rate, that enables us to attach a computational interpretation. Okay, now so much then for the idea that the computer revolt is at hand. What about the fact that everything is information? As Floridi says, we live in the infosphere. He loves these neologisms, and we're all inforgs. I don't like that one as well. We're all inforgs. We're informational organisms. And the answer to that is the same as the other one. Something is information only relative to an interpretation. So if you say the universe consists of information, it's not really analogous to Copernicus, Darwin, and Freud, his earlier examples, because they all tried to identify an observer-independent phenomenon. The operation of the solar system, in the case of Copernicus, the evolutionary development of species through natural selection, in the case of Darwin, and even Freud. I mean, whatever you think of it, he thought he had discovered a piece of the geography of the mind. The unconscious wasn't just some observer-relative phenomenon. He had discovered a territory in the mind. It's worth going back to read Freud because it's more extreme than you might think. He says, in itself, beware of Germans who say an sich, by the way, that has a bad history. In itself, a mental state is totally unconscious, and it becomes conscious on analogy with perception. Now, I don't think that works as a theory of consciousness or unconscious, but the point is, Freud thought he was doing a kind of geography of the mind. It wasn't observer-relative. Whereas I want to say this discussion of information, the idea that the universe consists of information, that's all observer-relative. It's not intrinsic. So there are two basic ideas I want to leave that I'm trying to get across. The first is that the syntax of the computer program isn't sufficient for semantics. What do you need? Well, obviously, you need a conscious mind. You need a conscious agent that's going to give an interpretation to the syntactical entities. And the second point is even the syntax isn't intrinsic to the physics. The first argument showed that the semantics is not intrinsic to the syntax. That's the old Chinese room argument. The second argument shows that the syntax is not intrinsic to physics. So computation in the observer-relative sense does not name a fact of physics. So you need to distinguish the existence of intrinsic computational processes performed by conscious agent from the observer-relative processes to which we can attach a computational interpretation. And to repeat, that's not trivial because, of course, we make epistemically objective claims. My computer really is better. And in a way, I have no objection to using the psychological vocabulary. Those guys tried hard to design a program that would beat Kasparov, and they succeeded. It did beat Kasparov. The mistake is to think that that has of some psychological relevance, that in the sense in which you or I play chess, the computer was playing chess. And by the way, if you want a decisive argument for that, do the Chinese room. Make it into a chess room. Suppose I don't know how to play chess, but I'm sitting there in a room with a lot of symbols, and symbols come in. I don't know what they mean, but they describe a chess position. I look up in the book what I'm supposed to do, and I give back symbols. They describe a chess move, and at the end, I win the chess game. We'll suppose, because they get so good at programming. All the same, I'm not playing chess. I don't understand anything about chess. But if I don't, neither does any other digital computer, because no computer has anything that I don't have. The computer is precisely that. It's a device for manipulating symbols. It's a syntactical engine, and the syntax is all observer-relative. Okay, now, that's kind of the introduction of my lecture on consciousness, but how much time did I leave myself? How much time have I got? Boss? Well, I don't know. All right, I'll look at my watch. I got a watch here. Oh my gosh. Well, but we're going to have a question period, right? I'll talk for a few minutes more. Anyway, okay. So here we are. We're well into the 21st century. That's a bit scary, that thought. But incidentally, when I was a kid, one of the questions was always, would I live to see the next century? And grown-ups would tell me, yeah, you're going to live to see the next century. And that's a great idea. I did get to live in the next century. The problem is that if you're brought up that way, when the next century comes, it's as if the calendar had stopped. You know, then, oh, we're in a new century. Oh, yeah, they have dates too. But anyway, it takes get used to the 21st century. Okay, why don't we solve the problem of consciousness? Why don't we just get busy and solve it as a biological problem? How would we go about it? Well, it seems to me, if you look at the history of science, there are 3 steps that typically you go through when you solve a problem like this. First, you discover correlations. You discover that a consciousness is correlated with certain types of neurobiological processes. And secondly, and we're all well on the way to that. There's even a name for these correlated processes. They're called neural correlates of consciousness, and the literature is abbreviated as the NCC. And there are is a lot of research done on discovering the NCC. And the great device that enables us to do that is the functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is, I think, a revolutionary tool in in cognitive science, generally psychology and cognitive science, as well as in medicine, because you can see what's happening. You can see that something in the brain is happening correlated with the cognitive process. So the first step would be to discover the NCC. And the second step is to find out if it's causal. And you do that by the standard mechanisms. You see if you can shut off consciousness by shutting off the NCC, and if you can turn it back on by turning on the NCC. Can you go from consciousness to unconsciousness in virtue of what's happening in the brain? And again, there is a lot of research, and we now know a lot from the use of the imaging technology. The fMRI is not the only one, but it is, as far as I know, the most effective of the imaging techniques. Okay, why haven't we succeeded? Why is it then that we still have a long way to go in figuring out how the brain causes consciousness? And the problem is that if you actually look at the literature, the typical research that is performed is typically performed on subjects that are already conscious. So for example, one example is with blind sight. There's a guy in Oxford, Larry Weiskrantz, and he discovered a patient who had damage to V1, that's back here in the back of your skull. And the result was that he was blind in a certain portion of the visual field, so that though he had normal vision in other parts of the visual field, in the lower left quadrant, he couldn't see anything. He couldn't see anything down there. Now, what happened was if you shined an X or an O very rapidly, you tell him to focus your eyes there, and then you ask him, what did you see? And he's so fast that he can't shift his eyes. He can't look down here. The subject says, I didn't see anything, but if you ask, well, what did it seem like? The subject will say, it seemed like an X or it seemed like an O. And at the end of a week of that, their subjects are getting it right 95% of the time. And you ask the guy, how did you do it? And he says, I don't know. I couldn't see a damn thing. He says, I'm quoting from Weiskrantz's book. So it looks like you've got two processes going on in the brain. You've got a conscious vision when you actually see something, and then you have unconscious vision. That's why Weiskrantz had called it blind sight, a bit of a provocative expression. But it looks like, I mean, what he concluded was there must be at least two visual systems, one of which is conscious and one of which is not conscious. And then some Canadians, Milner and Goodale, showed that maybe there are more than two. Okay, I think this research is terrific. But they thought, or many people thought, this will enable us to crack the problem of consciousness. Because if we can figure out the difference between you and me actually looking and seeing the X and the O, and the guy who unconsciously registers the X and the O, unconsciously registers that, then we will have discovered the key to consciousness, because from the mechanisms that distinguish those two will distinguish conscious processes from unconscious processes in general. And this research is part of a general project in psychology, which now has a long history of Gestalt psychology and Gestalt ambiguity and Gestalt switching. And the most famous example, one that every philosopher got from Wittgenstein, is the famous duck rabbit. And that, though I've done an even more incompetent job than usual of drawing it, is either a rabbit looking up at the sky, looking at the moon, these are his ears out here, or it's a duck looking that way. Has everybody got that? Now, it's very interesting, I find this kind of stuff fascinating because the stimulus is constant, okay? There was no change in the board when you see the rabbit and you see the duck, yet the experience is different. You have a constant stimulus with totally different experiences. Furthermore, once you lock onto one or the other, it's very hard just to see it as what it is, just a bunch of lines. And notice an interesting fact. It doesn't look the least bit like a duck or a rabbit. If you ask somebody, go buy me a rabbit, and somebody bought you something that looked like that, you'd want your money back, right? Okay, but now there must be some point in the brain at which it switches from seeing the duck to seeing the rabbit. And if you could find that point, when it switches from one form of consciousness to another, you'd have the NCC for those forms of consciousness. There are lots of experiments like this, and I don't have time to go into them, but here is the problem with all of these experiments, and that is they're performed on patients that are already conscious. They're performed on subjects that are conscious, and what we want is to figure out how the brain creates consciousness in the first place. You see, here is a remarkable fact. All of my conscious states come to me as part of a unified conscious field. So I don't just hear the sound of my voice and taste the water as I drink it and see the people standing at the back, but I have all of them in a single unified conscious field. And what we want to know is, how does the brain create that conscious field? The problem with these experiments is that the NCCs are too local. They're too local. They're local to specific parts of the brain activated by specific stimuli. But what we want to know is, how does the brain create consciousness in the first place? And it's very hard to do that, very hard to discover that with existing research techniques. Why? Well, you see, the standard picture that people have is that perception creates consciousness. And in a way, that's right, because my perception does give me consciousness I didn't have before. But I like to think of it this way. Imagine you wake up in a dark room, as I did this morning, away from home, and your first feeling is, where the hell am I? And it's dark, and you're not having any stimulus. All the same, you can become completely conscious, even though you have minimal perceptual stimulus, virtually none. Then you get up and get dressed and brush your teeth and go and have breakfast and so on. Now, are you creating consciousness when you do that? Well, in a sense, you are, but I want to say the right way to think of it is, when you woke up, the brain created the conscious field, and then your activities modified the conscious field by introducing perceptions into it. So one of the reasons I think we're having so much trouble in neurophysiology discovering the actual mechanisms by which consciousness is produced is that the research techniques that we use, single-cell recordings and various imaging techniques, they're too local. They're too local, too much to do to specific reactions to specific stimuli. And what we're looking for is a general account of how the brain creates the conscious field in the first place. And we're a long way from that. That, I think, is the most exciting question in the sciences today. How does the brain create consciousness? And I hope somebody here, one of you, or maybe a team of you, will discover that, because it is an exciting question and research is going on. Now, part of the difficulty is, I've been militating against, is don't change the subject. If you change the subject, if you think, well, what we really want to do is to discover the computer program in the brain that's creating consciousness. No computer program is creating consciousness. It couldn't, because the computer program exists as a program only relative to a computational interpretation. And what we're interested in is, what are the distinctive observer-independent facts about the brain that enable it to create consciousness. Well, I didn't cover everything I wanted to cover, but with your patience, I managed to cover at least some of it. Thank you very much.
So Professor Searle is going to address questions. There are 2 microphones either side of the hall. So if you'd step to a microphone, and he'll field his own questions. I'll just be here to cut it off.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Very nice, interesting lecture. Thank you. You know, there are a number of activities that we carry out all the time that are not conscious. There are many things that we learn to do without being completely aware that we are doing them. You know, we learn to do something and they become involuntary things. And we have to be able to separate those two, because they're learned processing activities.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what claim you're making is this, but it's clear that there's one thing I left out of this talk which is crucial, and that is an awful lot of the things that we do. we're not focusing our attention on. And it's tempting to say we're unconscious of them. So when I walk around, I'm not thinking about how much pressure my feet exert against the soles of my shoes. And I'm not focusing my attention on these circular lights overhead. All the same, they're parts of my conscious field, and I can shift attention from one to another. The mistake is to think that somehow or other they're totally unconscious. And no, they're not totally unconscious. I am conscious of the lights overhead in a way that I'm not conscious of what's behind my head because I can't see it. It's just these are not at the focus of my attention. Now, in fact, there is a lot of interesting neurobiological research done on attention, and you can see why it is a beautiful subject to study. Because it's, you can find out, you can get the subject to focus attention on one thing and now on another thing and then see what goes on. I'm sorry to say I'm not sure I answered your question because my hearing isn't all that great and I may not have heard it. So if you want to ask it again, you get a second try.
Well, you pointed out to something that I have worked myself for some years on attention and precisely of the things that we are aware of, not aware of,
Yeah.
and we have to actually concentrate on certain things in spite of the fact that we have all the information coming to us from the external world, yes.
Okay, there is a lot of psychological research now done on awareness, which is really literally unconscious, but which registers on our cognitive capacities, and you get people priming effects and so on. I mean, there are a lot of people who probably know the research much better than I do, where the guy will answer questions in a certain way, and you know he was primed to answer it by a stimulus that he was unconscious of. So there are all sorts of unconscious processes going on. I agree with that. Let's go over to this guy. Yeah.
Is there such a thing as false consciousness?
Yeah.
And if consciousness is relative, how could it possibly be false?
Yeah, okay. No, I have to tell you something personal here. When I was a kid, there used to be a lot of people running around that I would argue with. They were called Marxists. And I kind of miss them because they went out of business and you hardly hear of them. And when did I last hear false consciousness? I mean, the standard argument that went against me is, you suffer from the false consciousness because you are demonstrating your commitment to the bourgeois way of life because you're a beneficiary of the bourgeois mode of existence. You are employed by this bourgeois institution, the University of California, Berkeley, and so on. So sure, there's false consciousness, but the sense in which that's used as a technical term really is different from the sense here. Marx thought there are sincere views that people hold, but the views are corrupted by their class situation, and consequently, though they hold conscious views, it's false consciousness. It's not real consciousness about how things are in the world. Fortunately, I wasn't lecturing about that, but anyway, grateful to have it raised. Yes?
Hey, I was a little puzzled by your use of the word create when you talk about the brain creating consciousness.
Yeah.
Elsewhere, when you talk about the problem of consciousness, you say, well, look, we should think of the brain, the consciousness in relation to the brain on analogy with digestion,
right.
As in relation to the biology of the stomach, or liquidity as in relation to the arrangement of molecules in a certain kind of structure. But in those kind of cases, it's not that the output is a creation. It's just cells arranged in terms of in a digestive structure within a living system just is the process of digestion, or liquidity just is the arrangement of molecules in a certain kind of arrangement. Is that how you're? I'm often puzzled by exactly.
Oh no, I think that's a very deep question.
Yeah.
And it's a deep philosophical question. Let me state exactly the thesis I hold and exactly the problem that you have identified with it. Consciousness is a higher level or system feature of the brain in the sense that it's the elements of the system that create consciousness, but the consciousness is not a feature of any element. So I can't pick a single neuron and say this one is thinking about my grandmother. You have to have a system big enough to create consciousness as a system feature. Now, that's exactly like liquidity in water. I give that because it's an unmysterious case. The stuff in here is liquid, and it's liquid because the molecules are behaving in a certain way. They behave in a way that's different from if they were slowed down and became solid, or they speeded up and became a gas. So liquidity is a higher level or system feature of the system of molecules, and it's caused by the behavior of the molecules. Okay, that's the analogy I like, and it just domesticates consciousness. But the difficulty with the analogy is the one you pointed out, namely, in the case of the molecules, there's nothing going on except the behavior of the molecules, and we can consequently reduce the liquidity to the behavior of the molecules. We say liquidity just is a certain kind of molecular behavior. Now, in that way, you can't reduce consciousness. You can't eliminate it because it's got this subjective ontology that I talked about earlier. It's got a subjective ontology, and that's still left over. So in a way that you can reduce solidity and liquidity, you can't reduce consciousness. Now, my answer to that is, well, you can do a causal reduction. There's nothing there causally except the behavior of the neurons that causes your brain to be in a conscious state. But you can't do an ontological reduction because the consciousness has this additional feature. It's got this subjective or first-person ontology. Now, what I deeply think, but I don't know how to show it in a short space of time, is in a way that we reduce liquidity to the behavior of the molecules, you can't really reduce anything that actually exists. So it's true that the solidity of this object consists in the vibratory movements of the molecules in lattice structures. Yeah, but that causes it to do things like resist pressure. It actually supports objects. The object won't pass through it. And that is a real feature. And we didn't get rid of that when we reduced the solidity to the behavior of the molecules. That's still left over. Now, it seems it's a bigger deal for us with consciousness because we have this incredible history. Consciousness is such a huge thing in our history, and we think it's so important. Good idea, remind yourself, our little planetary system and our little sun is one of 100 billion such stars in the Milky Way. I don't know how many of them can sustain life, but there's 100 billion of them in the Milky Way. And how many galaxies are there like the Milky Way? 100 billion. I mean, that's a lot of zeros. I lose track of the zeros. So we're just a small operation, but to us, consciousness is a big deal. And I think it must be exist in other parts of the universe. We just don't know where they are or how we'd get to them. They're too many light years away. But we're talking about a very small part of the world produced by a lot of big carbon-based molecules, lots of hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. And it's clear that consciousness exists, clear that it has a first-person ontology, clear that it's causally reducible to, but not ontologically reducible. The problem here is not consciousness, it's the notion of reduction. It's the notion that somehow or other, when you reduce the solidity, you got rid of it. It doesn't really exist. I don't think that's true. I don't think in that sense you can reduce anything that really exists. However, I didn't really show that. That's just the bottom line of my discussion. Yes?
Going to your marvelously angst-filled case of waking up in the dark room and creating the field of consciousness, is uncertainty central to that experience? And do you think that our experience of uncertainty as mortal creatures may be formative of consciousness itself?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question. Uncertainty, I mean, a standard definition of information, one I think is unsatisfactory, is a reduction of uncertainty. But if somebody talks about uncertainty, I want to know, what is it exactly that you're uncertain about? I'm uncertain about the results of the elections that are going to happen in November. Who's going to take over? Who's going to be in charge of the Senate and the House? That's a typical case of uncertainty. But that's not a defining feature of consciousness, nor, I think, is it a defining feature of information that it reduces that. So I'm not sure how uncertainty figures in this discussion.
Well, I'll let someone else ask another question.
Okay, well, thank you for your patience. Yes, you're on.
Hello, Professor Searle. Thanks for coming out and talking with us today. Like most people in this room, I wrote a paper about your ideas in freshman philosophy, and now that I'm a doctoral student in the corner of computer science concerned with creation of artificial intelligence. I spend most of my waking hours trying to prove you wrong. So, given that,
Good luck.
I have a question that I'm sure you're asked on nearly a daily basis. I've gathered that you feel that consciousness has a physical chemical basis.
Yeah.
And now that research in theoretical chemistry and complex systems has developed, we're now getting close to the era where we can simulate complex materials to an arbitrary degree such that any measurement you could make on a physical material, you can make an analogous measurement on the computational material. So given that the consciousness has this physical chemical basis, if we could simulate a brain to the degree such that any measurement you made on a real brain, you could make an analogous computation, in what sense would this brain not be conscious, this computational brain?
No, it's a good question. And the question is, what do you simulate and what do you duplicate? Suppose you did a perfect computational simulation of my brain, and you did, imagine we do it down to every neuron. So for every neuron in the brain, there is some sort of a computational sequence in the computer. Will it be conscious? No, because the brain doesn't just simulate those processes, it realizes those processes. It has those processes in an intrinsic or observer-independent fashion. What the computer constructs is a model. And you can do a model of the flow of income in the Bloomington economy, or the pattern of rainstorms in weather in Indiana. But the simulation of the rainstorms won't rain, and the simulation of the economy won't make money. The simulation of a 5-alarm fire won't burn the house down. All of those are models. Now, this is one of the key notions I want to get across. The simulation of brain processes that produce consciousness is to actual consciousness, as the simulation of the flow of money is to actually making money or actually losing money. Or this, my favorite example, the simulation of digestive processes is to actual digestion. You do a perfect computer simulation of digestion on your computer. You can't then rush out and buy a pizza and stuff it in the computer, because it'll just jam the computer, because what the computer gives you is a model or a picture, and that's very useful. It's terrific to have these models. Now, why would we make this mistake? Nobody thinks a computer model of digestion will digest, but they think a computer model of thinking will think. And the mistake is a deep mistake, and it goes back to these mistakes I mentioned earlier. They suppose that the consciousness is not an ordinary part of the physical world like digestion. Along with the dualist tradition, they think it's something formal or abstract. It's not a part of the actual physical reality we all live in, and that's the deep mistake. And that's, if I have two targets I'm militating against, one is the idea that consciousness is not a part of the physical world because it's something spiritual, and the other is it's not a part of the physical world because it's not something spiritual. And those are both mistaken. It is a part of the physical world, and that's my main message. Yes, you're on.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. These guys over here, I didn't want to leave them out. Who am I to turn down a guy on the left wing? Yes.
I appreciate that. So, Professor Searle, I just wanted to ask a question, make sure I understood something you said earlier about the chess example.
Yeah.
Supposing that I was going to play a computer, and I haven't played, and I don't know how to play chess.
Yeah.
And somebody teaches me and says, okay, if you see this move, do this. If you see this move, do this.
Yeah.
Say I then play the computer. My question is, maybe in multi-part. One, is it the same? Are we doing the same process in that sense? In the sense that I'm getting input and I'm having an output the same way the computer is. And if there is a difference, is the difference that there was already a pre-existing conscious field for me that I learned it through versus the computer that didn't have that field?
Okay. No, those are good questions, and the answer is, if you just think of what it's like to actually play chess, that involves a whole series of conscious operations. Kasparov has to know such things as that he opened with his pawn to king 4 and that his queen is under a threat by the knight on the right-hand side. He has to know all that. Now, the computer doesn't know any of that because it doesn't know anything. It's just a piece of electronics that goes through certain state transitions which we can interpret. Now, I put myself in an intermediate position where I don't know I'm playing chess, but I do consciously go through the steps in the computer program. So what I have is not actual chess pieces or even chess symbols. I just have a lot of zeros and ones. And when I get this sequence, then I'm told write down this sequence, and unknown to me, that means I'm moving my knight. But there, I might perform exactly the same moves as a real chess player, but I'm not playing chess. To play chess, you got to be conscious that you're playing chess. And that's the problem with the chess-playing machine. It's not conscious and it doesn't play chess, not in a literal sense. Now, let me give you the qualification immediately. It does what those guys designed it to do. They succeeded at what they were trying to do. I am not arguing with their success. I am arguing with the interpretation of this success. The interpretation of the success is that in exactly the same sense that Kasparov beat Karpov, Deep Blue beat Kasparov. That is a deep mistake. That's the mistake of our culture, and that's what I'm militating against. Because in that sense, Deep Blue didn't play chess because it doesn't know it's playing chess. To play chess, you got to know you're playing chess, and it doesn't know anything. Okay, more questions? Yeah.
Yeah. All of the attributors of human states, of conscious states that I know of, are human observers.
Yeah.
So what could it possibly mean to say that consciousness has an observer-independent existence?
Right, yeah. It has an observer-independent existence in that though it is all observer-relative phenomena are created by consciousness, the consciousness that creates it is not itself observer-relative. This thing functions as a marker, and that is a function that's assigned to it by a conscious agent. But my consciously deciding to use it as a marker, that's not observer-relative. That's an intrinsic fact about me. Just to summarize this point, this is an absolutely crucial point for the whole talk. The consciousness that creates observer-relative phenomena, money, property, government, marriage, universities, political parties, and elections, that consciousness creates observer-relative phenomena, but the consciousness is not itself observer-relative. The consciousness is intrinsic or independent. So if somebody says, well, you weren't really thinking about arithmetic when you did this computation on the blackboard. Oh, yes, I was thinking about arithmetic, and that's intrinsic to me. That doesn't depend on anybody else. One of the dumbest things in our tradition, and we're partly responsible, Descartes partly responsible for this, was the idea that animals don't have consciousness. Now, you can see why Descartes had to say that. If consciousness is a property of the soul, and the soul is immortal, then if animals have consciousness, they have to have immortal souls. But it's ridiculous. I mean, I've had, my dogs have been Frege, Russell, Ludwig, and now Tarski. And there's no question that they're conscious. I wish Tarski's a large Bernese mountain dog, weighs about as much as anybody in this room. And I would love to have brought him here because you want to see a consciousness in action. Tarski is conscious. But it is part of our tradition that we don't know how to cope with consciousness. We don't. And when I first got interested in this, I told you people felt it's not really a suitable subject for science. And in those days, when I said in the cognitive science meeting, we got to focus on consciousness, the graduate students are always a good barometer of which way the wind is blowing, would rub their eyes and say, oh, God, there he goes on again about consciousness. But it's happening. We're now starting to get more attention to consciousness. One last question.
Hi, wonderful lecture, by the way. But one of the things that was on my mind for most of the lecture was something that you said. It was that motivation and belief are observer-independent.
Yes, yeah.
And I was wondering, really, how you would, well, I was thinking about how we ascribe motivation to other conscious beings. We interpret their actions, see if they follow a common theme or pattern, and then decide, oh, this person has beneficent or maleficent motivations.
Yeah.
So, but that seems to be observer relative. In other words, the method of interpretation basically determines what kind of motivation you ascribe. So my question is, how can you, in an epistemically objective sense, decide that something has motivation or belief?
Okay.
Or that motivation or belief is observer independent?
It's a real philosopher's question, and I'm grateful for it. If you're not a philosopher, come and see me. You should. Because clearly, look, there is another mistake that is pervasive in our philosophical culture, and that is the confusion of epistemology with ontology, is the feeling that what it is for our motivation to exist is a matter of how we find out about it. And a standard mistake is to say, you'd be surprised how often this is said, the reason that we say that people have beliefs and desires is so we can predict their behavior. I don't know about you, but the reason I say I have beliefs and desires is because I have beliefs and desires. It's just a plain fact. I mean, what behavior can predict if you know that I believe that the Earth is 93 million miles from the sun? What's the behavior? That when I buy a ticket to the sun, I'll buy a 93 million mile ticket? I mean, it's just not serious. So the mistake is to suppose that the ontology of the mental is in its epistemology. It's not. And if the question is, well, how do you find out what somebody's motivations are? That's tough. And often she will conceal it from you. I mean, there are ways you can be easily fooled about motivations, and we often are. But that doesn't mean there's no such thing as getting it right. Think about your own case. So if you ask me, well, how do I find out other people's motivations? Use your head. That would be my advice. Ask them questions, look at their behavior, and so on. But don't confuse the observation that you make of the behavior with the actual ontology, with what it is to actually have a motivation.
Join me in thanking Professor Searle.
Thank you.